another category. But thank you so much for inviting me. We were supposed to be doing this about this time last year, and there was this thing called COVID that interrupted everything. So I want to start by thanking all of you for inviting me. Thank you, Elvis, for probably putting my name forth, and Sarah and Lyndon for all their work in putting this together. I've organized so many conferences in my life, and it is so much work. But I will tell all you graduate students out there, organizing a conference is a microcosm of some of the administrative tasks that you will be expected to do throughout your career. And so take what you can from it and use it in the future. I also am so psyched to be sharing this virtual stage with Paul Toth, with whom I had one of the best dinners of all the dinners I've had at AAAL in Boston. I had the snapper. I still remember it, Paul. That was so much fun. Okay, let's get started. I just want to say that all of my ideas are mine and they do not necessarily reflect those of my employers. That's my caveat. So what am I going to talk about? I had a pretty ambitious abstract and I decided to stick to it because one of the nice things about a virtual conference is if you get tired of standing up, you can just sit down and keep plowing through, right? So I'm going to start by talking about the context, delve into virtual assessment, spend some time on ethical issues. One thing I really wanted to touch on, especially because this conference is on life is one of the themes, which I love, looking at implications for professional development. And then finally, one of my new themes, which is using assessment for relationships, which those of you who've known me for a long time are probably shocked that I would talk about such a thing at a conference, but we're all growing during COVID, right? All right, so let's start with context. This is a picture I actually took on March 16th in Philadelphia last year. My son was a student at Temple at the time, and I was running around the city. I just want you to think about what things were like on March 16th, 2020. I went for a run in the city to help move him out of his dorm at Temple, and there were no masks. I remember going to a coffee shop and being vaguely terrified of the fact that there were all these people kind of breathing possibly COVID air. And there was supposed to be a run that was happening that weekend and all the signs were being taken down. So just think about what the context was like about 13 months ago. This is a photo I took, I think in Philadelphia, it might've been Atlanta around December of last year. COVID vaccine not yet available. I think sometimes when we're dealing with a context, we're in live time and we need a minute to think about what it was like when there wasn't a vaccine available. This other picture is Washington, DC. I want you to think about what time you think it is when I took this. Okay. I took that picture at 8:30 p.m. in April of last year in Georgetown. I actually have never seen Georgetown that quiet. I'm not a late night person, but I reckon it's not even that quiet at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is a picture I took in Philly on November of 2020, the Saturday after the election. And then this is a picture from last summer. So I want us to think about all the things that happened in the last year that have influenced the context for teaching, for learning, and for assessment, and all the ethical issues that are inherent in dealing with these issues. So this is part one of the context. This is the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, which I guess is your local paper for those of you who are situated at Temple. On Wednesday, April 14th, I tried to get it almost exactly a year ago. And you see freezing tuition, you see this masked hospital employee at Thomas Jefferson Hospital, and you see officials telling residents to stay home as Pennsylvania discusses easing coronavirus rules. I thought that was a little ironic. And I also just wanted you to think about what the headlines said a year ago. That's something I like to do periodically from every month or so, thinking what was happening a year ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So now I'm going to talk about the educational context. In spring of 2020, you might remember that in-person school was mostly halted. And what we found was that universities tended to close, for the semester. They tended to say, oh, you're not coming back. And I think there were very different responses to it. We could probably talk about that till the cows come home, but there were a lot of different contexts for how universities closed. Some of them closed very abruptly, some gave spring break, some said, here's a 2-hour window to pick up things. But let's talk about K-12. What happened in a lot of K-12 programs was that they closed for weeks with updates. Oh, we're going to be back on April 6th. We're going to be back on April 26th. We're going to be back on May 1st. Guess what? We're not coming back. One of the things that happened was the access to physical materials were limited. I was working with my team the other day and thinking how much I miss the whiteboard in my office at work. And this is not a huge problem, but at home, I have really strange walls. I think they're plaster, which makes it really hard to hang things. So I don't have a whiteboard at home. Plus, my daughter redecorated my office for me, and I don't think she really liked the aesthetic of a whiteboard, if you know what I mean. And this meant that our in-person resources were limited. It meant a lot of the things we counted on for teaching and learning and assessment, we didn't have access to. I can't tell you how many times in the past year I've reached for a book and thought, where is that? And since I have an appointment in 2 places, it wasn't just a matter of where is it, but which office is it at? And do I have access to that office? I have not been to my office at Georgetown since August of 2020. And that's where a lot of my books are. So I'm just trying to contextualize this. And we talked a lot about pivoting. I actually preferred to talk of it as pirouetting, and I tried to find a picture of someone pirouetting, but you can't get a picture of someone pirouetting because if you do it properly, you're just kind of whipping around like this, and you're trying to focus on one thing so that you don't fall over. And I actually think pirouetting is a better way to talk about how we went virtual. We had to keep our eye on one thing. Those of you who are dancers know what it's like, and you just keep going around and around. And this lack of warning was super hard because there were instructor limitations. I'm actually giving a plenary in China tomorrow, only from here, which is, again, something that if I'd said a year ago, you all would have looked probably a little bit more mystified. And they asked us to all practice sharing our PowerPoint on Zoom. And it was the kind of thing where we all just stayed and made small talk for 20 minutes so that it, became a meaningful meeting, but all of us knew how to do that. I can't say that that would have happened a year ago. There are also limitations for students. A lot of students, and I'll get more into this when I talk about ethics, a lot of students didn't know how to participate in online. My own sister is a first grade teacher, and so I've heard a lot about how hard it is to teach the littles online. When you move something like language instruction online, the construct shifts radically. Expectations are different. And I just want to point out that a year ago, everyone was saying that, teachers should make $1 million a year. And by the fall, a lot of people were saying teachers should go back to school. What about their health? So I just want us to think about what it means when language instruction goes online like that, so suddenly and with no warning and no professional development to accompany it. Now, I want to talk about assessment because, of course, that's my thing. But what happened, because it was, March, spring breakish for a lot of universities and schools, at least in the US context. So what I found was a lot of things kind of got a little looser, and then boom, final exams had to happen online. And that was a huge changed construct because how do you have final exams online when you're used to being in person? You're used to being able to either play things in live context for listening, you're able to send students or bring them up to your desk and do a quick oral assessment. You're able to watch to make sure that students are, not cheating, to be blunt, and also to make sure that nothing's going wrong. If a student falls ill during an exam and they're in front of you, you can take care of it, right? It meant we had new security needs. Administering final exams online is super difficult when you've never done it before. And this really led to a huge issue because there were huge differentiations in terms of resources. And that means resources that instructors had, resources that students had, resources that administrators had, as well as the understanding of the resources that were available, right? Then there was comfort level with virtual tests. How comfortable were the instructors, the students, the administrators in having these tests take place virtually? Also understanding the requirements. I remember a young person in my life who was taking an exam had to download a certain program to take the exam online to make sure that they could be proctored, to make sure that no cheating was taking place. And I just want to point out all of this was happening during this really terrible, terrible time when it was risky to do daily activities. And there was a lot of fear and unknown. There was a lot of ambiguity. We know a lot more than we did a year ago. I expect in 10 years, we're going to look back in retrospect and say, well, that thing we were doing didn't make any sense. How many of us were washing, spending 10 minutes a day washing our groceries, right? So our social emotional health was compromised, and that has a huge impact on teaching and learning, and definitely on assessment. And so the educational context was ambiguous. There was a lot of fear, and there were mixed messages. One administrator might be saying one thing, another administrator might be saying another thing, and the instructor might be saying something different to their students. So that's a really hard educational context, and it's really hard for assessment. So let's talk about the large-scale testing context, okay? A lot of in-person high-stakes tests were canceled or moved online. At the secondary level, things like the seal of biliteracy, if you're familiar with it, I can't look out and see how many of you look confused, so I'm going to give you the 2-minute description of the seal of biliteracy. It's a test in the US given mostly to high school seniors. Sometimes schools pay for it, sometimes schools have to pay for it. It's a whole different line of research I'm involved in. And it attests to a student's proficiency in 2 languages. Not shockingly, in the US context, it varies by state. So, what earns you the seal of biliteracy in Massachusetts might not earn it for you in California. But most of those tests were administered in school and awarded in school, right? The AP was moved online. The IB was moved online. I don't want to point to any test in particular because I work at ACTFL and I don't want to be biased, but I will say that there was a lot of confusion, a lot of shifting perspectives, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of Twitter, a lot of tweeting going on about what was happening with all these tests. In addition, there were other high stakes tests for things like university admission, like TOEFL and IELTS. In February of 2020, my last overseas trip in 14 months, which is very unusual for me, I happened to be in England at a conference, and I was with a bunch of folks from the British Council and IELTS, which are British-based testing companies. And they said to me, February 2020, wow, Meg, did you hear that they canceled all TOEFL and IELTS tests in China for until April? I thought, gosh, until April, can you imagine how hard that's going to be for the students and the loss of revenue? I know you should all chuckle a little bit that was my thought in February. And then there were other tests, there are other tests for admissions, for teacher certification, for licensure that got canceled or moved online. And it's not just that they were moved online, it's that it was a moving target for a long time. How are we going to make these tests available to people? And what's the messaging? Because one thing I can tell you, working at ACTFL and working in assessment, you want your messaging to be clear because you only want to send a message once because there's enough confusion about one change. Just think about all the changes. Oh, the tests are going to be available in April. No, April 15th. No, May 4th. No, maybe whatever. So it was a really hard context. However, because testing always comes to the rescue, here we were. So in the spring of 2020, I think it was the spring, last spring seems like a very long period of time to me. Dan Isbell and Benji Kreml talked about 3 issues in general testing moving to online, and they looked at 4 different tests, and they talked about these 3 major issues that came up. And I really think they captured the spirit of what was happening there. And that was technology, security, and validity. So that was last spring. Then language assessment quarterly. And again, I have a few colleagues in testing here. I just want you to think about how hard it is to pivot, or as I like to say, pirouette, a special issue that has already come out in language assessment quarterly, looking at various topics in assessment. Spiros Papageorgiou talked about access. This guy, Elvis Wagner, very famous tester. You should all try to take a class with him. Talked a lot about placement. Jim Purpura talked about proctoring. And then Gary Oakey and some of his colleagues talked about international teaching assistants. So these are all large-scale testing issues that emerged in 2020 that we needed to start wrestling with. So I'm just going to leave this up for a second. I want you to just think, on March 9th, my daughter was raising money for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and we went to a gala on, I think it was March 9th. And within a week, or a week and a half, we were in lockdown. And similarly, whatever was planned for language assessment quarterly in the fall or early winter, fall of 2020 or early winter of 2021, all of these new articles came out in that time. And then real props to Dan and Benji, Isabel and Kreml, that they reviewed these 4 tests and talked about these 3 major issues that I'm going to focus on in a bit. Okay, so let's summarize the context generally. I'm sorry, this is very grim, but we're going to get, there's sunshine and rainbows ahead, don't worry. The context was really hard. Information changed very rapidly. I'm a parent of a college student and a high school student, and I can tell you, keeping up with the changes was really hard. My best friend who lives across the street from me is actually a teacher in the public school where my daughter goes to school. So sometimes I would get a message and of course I couldn't walk across the street and walk into her house and say, hey, what does this mean? I'd have to text her. Hey, I just got this. Do you have any idea what it means? So there was all this information coming out about everything from how the virus is transmitted to how you're going to take your assessment in school. And it changed. So we had a lot of stuff we had to keep track of. The data were confusing. Those of us who are in assessment know, and those of us who do any kind of research know, how you count things, how things are being counted is very important. How is that data being counted? And so the data were confusing. In addition, we all remember last summer, I had a picture from a Black Lives Matter protest. There was a lot of racial violence, and there was a lot of attention paid to it. People were home. They were probably watching the news a lot more, and it became very difficult to do things like go to a protest because in addition to it being possibly physically difficult because of policing politics, also masking and staying 6 feet apart. There was a lot of fear from your personal safety in terms of leaving your house, in terms of violence, in terms of getting corona, and so on. And there was this huge lack of precedence. What do we do in a pandemic? The last real pandemic we had in this country was in 1918. My own grandmother was a young woman at that time. I really wish I had thought to ask her when she was alive, what was it like during the 1918 flu pandemic? But even if she had told me, I don't even know if she had a phone in her house. I don't even know if she had electricity then, right? So all this precedence. And I think part of the issue too is we didn't know what was going to happen. There's a lot of things that happen in testing and teaching, and it's hard, but there's precedence and the outcome is pretty much known. There might be a series of different outcomes, but we don't know what they are. And then finally, there was a lot of political unrest. So I just want everybody to take a minute and think about what a tough year it was. And yet here we were still trying to teach and test and move people along in the system. Whew. I get tired just looking at this. And so what happened in assessment was a reflection of what was happening in the world. It always is. What's interesting is often in teaching and assessment, things that are happening socially take a little bit of time to catch up. In this point, they just slammed, they hit each other like that. Technology changed. The constructs shifted. There was definite unequal access to technology, to schooling, to assessments, and security became a huge issue. It's one thing to have a student in front of you showing you their ID and saying, yes, that is Margaret Malone. She is going to be taking the TOEFL today. This is definitely she, and finding ways to do it online. And I just see someone's in the chat, so I'm just going to make sure that I'm not doing something. Okay, yeah, I'll check the chat from time to time, just in case. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about advantages and disadvantages of virtual assessment. I've set kind of a grim scene. It was pretty grim a year ago. It's still pretty grim in a lot of ways, but I want to talk about advantages and disadvantages because there are advantages to virtual assessment. And we need to think about the fact that there was actually a lot of online assessment that existed at Actful where I work. Most of the tests we use were already happening online. It's that they were administered in a classroom, not that the test construct was set up for the test to take place in a classroom. The test was already happening on a computer. And so really the new thing was how to make this happen outside of a school setting. And then within new situations for assessment, there was the local situation, you know, the difference between a teacher trying to administer an assessment at home, from home to students at home versus in their classroom. And of course, the large scale option. So in this virtual assessment, there were definitely challenges, and actually I'm sugarcoating it. There were absolute difficulties, but there are also opportunities in virtual assessment that we can find. Oh, wait, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So I'm going to tell you a little story. To prepare for this, a few weeks ago, except for a few times when my internet was out in the past year, I have great internet. My spouse is super techie. One of the things that my spouse made sure of was that there was enough internet for the two of us to work from home and our daughter to have access. So I decided to spend a day as if I did not have good internet at home. And what did I do? There's, of course, the opportunity to use internet from home. Some people have hotspots, and then there's publicly available, right? But let's see how this went. So at home, fine. So I spent a day trying to figure out what I would do if I didn't have good internet at home. And so I looked up, I have a nice iPhone. How do you get a hotspot? I'd never done a hotspot. I'd had, you know, a physical separate hotspot from work, which died in the middle of the pandemic. And so I went on my phone and I followed the directions and I realized there was no way for me to have a hotspot. So I was away. I actually was away with my daughter. I texted my spouse, why can't I get a hotspot on my computer? And he said, well, you know, that's not part of our package. And I was like, you know what? I'm doing this thing where I don't have access to internet for a day and I need a hotspot. So this has a very happy ending. We were very early adopters of mobile phones back in the 90s before a lot of you were probably even alive. And so we had this super sweet deal because they just kind of kept giving us the same deal we'd had for 26 years with our provider. But my spouse was up for the challenge and he called them up and said, hey, what can we do for a hotspot? And this is great. We ended up with free Hulu. Who knew? Our bill went down and we got free Hulu. So don't be afraid to ask for what you need, I guess, is the issue. And I also had to figure out how to watch my hotspot so that I'm only using my hotspot for work and not to watch The Handmaid's Tale when it comes out next week when I already have good internet available. The other thing I did was to find publicly available internet. Last spring, a lot of my friends joked that they drove to the public library and sat there and worked in their car for a while just to get away from their busy houses with multiple people shouting over the internet to have meetings. So I went to the public. The first thing I did actually with my hotspot was try to work from my car. And it was really hot. Even though it was like 50 degrees out, it was really hot. It was too bright. I'm sure all of you are aware of this, but most of us don't have things that we can pull down in our car. So it was very hard to see the screen. And it was kind of embarrassing. I, did not look like a professional with an office behind me. I looked like somebody sitting in her car working, which was not great. It was also a little uncomfortable. You can't see me in person. I'm a small person. I'm about 5'2". I'm the kind of person when I sit in an airplane, the people next to me are like, oh, good, I get the armrest and more space. That was not the case when I was trying to work from my car. And I was sitting there the whole time thinking, imagine trying to take a test from this situation. This was a very short experience for me, and I'm really lucky, but accessing this hotspot in my car, sitting there with the sun beating down on me was really hard. And it was 50 degrees. What if it had been, 90 degrees or 20 degrees, okay? The other thing I did was find some publicly available Wi-Fi. I was not able to access it well from my car because of where I went. So I went and sat outside. And it was, it would have been lovely to sit there and, I don't know, watch The Office or answer email quietly. But in the sun, it was too bright to work. And in the shade, it got a little cold. So yes, it's wonderful that we make these things available. But the whole time I was thinking, imagine sitting outside the Manchester, Massachusetts Public Library, trying to take a multiple choice test, or worse yet, trying to respond to an oral proficiency test because that's all you have available. So that's my little story of how I stretched my privilege to figure out what it's like to not have good internet. It was tough. So let's talk a little bit about some advantages and disadvantages. The truth is, as we see very often in our lives, our challenges are our strengths and our strengths are our challenges. The nice thing about virtual assessment is for some students, it makes them less anxious because as many years ago when I developed a test that was administered online, not online, by telephone, remember those landlines? We asked the students what they thought about them talking on the telephone in a language instead of face-to-face with a teacher. One of the students said, it's nice because when I make a mistake, the teacher doesn't make that face. So yes, there are advantages in terms of anxiety for online and virtual assessment. There's also a disadvantage in that you're sitting there, as I was this morning, texting my spouse, would you please come up and update Zoom for me, or I can't get my battery, because we have an administrator system so that I don't break the internet in my house. There's also comfort. As I mentioned, the day that I spent looking for internet was very uncomfortable. The benches at the Manchester, Massachusetts Public Library are very nice for sitting and having a sandwich, not so much for working for 2.5 hours. On the other hand, sitting here giving this plenary, as I mentioned, I'm a small person. I probably would have had to adjust the microphone several times. And it's quite possible that if I were wearing heels, I would have fallen over. So there's a lot to be said, right, for virtual assessment. Some people are more comfortable in their homes. Other people, it's less comfortable, right? There's also availability of the internet. I've worked with internet-based testing as long as it's been available. And one of the early, and by early, I mean, what year is it? 8, 9 years ago, was arguments against it was, we don't have the bandwidth to administer tests in schools, right? I just want you to think about that. Within the last 8 years, there were schools that were saying that, can't do it. So one of the advantages is, honestly, some people have better access to the internet at home than they did at school, right? But it's also a disadvantage. A lot of people don't. One of the advantages, as I mentioned, no proctor to make you nervous. Most of you are in graduate programs, and I imagine you're the kind of students who worried that someone might think you were cheating just because, as I always did when I was a student, just because I was, a people pleaser, and I just worried that somebody would try to cheat off me and I wouldn't notice and I'd get in terrible trouble. So there was no proctor there to make me nervous. So that would be an advantage for me. But the disadvantage, of course, is with online systems. How long is this thing running? I was doing a professional development program for work yesterday, and it had this quiz system. And it was very meta for me because in addition to wanting to figure out how to respond correctly, I would also say things like, is this drag and drop? Is this so on? How does it work? And I thought, man, this is extremely low stakes. It's really self-assessment to become a better manager. I don't even think anybody except me saw the results, but I was unfamiliar with it. And it made me a little anxious. And there were a couple times when the answer I gave wasn't right because I dragged and dropped the wrong way. So think about familiarity with online systems. How many times do we push the wrong button? Again, the advantage is you don't have to worry about a human accusing you of cheating. I don't know how many of you remember when you were young and you wrote things on your hand, like remember the person you were going to call or what you had to do after school. So you don't have to worry so much about that, but there's actual cheating coming from an instructor and a test developer standpoint. We want to make sure that we're getting the real data from the students. One of the advantages of online assessment is you can outline the logistics. This is exactly what you're going to have to do, and you can think about a few situations. I was doing something, where was I? I guess I was in a hotel. Oh yeah, during AAAL, I met a friend, and we, for those of you who don't know, AAAL is the American Association of Applied Linguistics. So we weren't vaccinated yet, so I met my friend and we stayed in hotel rooms next to each other. We ate all of our meals 6 feet apart outside, but we were on opposite ends of the wall. We could hear each other, working. And it was super fun because we could trade logistics and know what was going on. And in the middle of it, a fire alarm went off. And I did my, 20-second rule. I don't leave until I'm sure in a hotel that it's really a fire alarm and not just somebody testing it. We were lucky they were just testing it. But the disadvantage, because with assessment, if you don't know what you're supposed to do, that changes the construct. How do you know if a student got an item wrong because they don't know the language or because they don't know what they're supposed to do? That is the crux of assessment. I spend more time on directions than items when I'm developing a new assessment, okay? So if you don't know what you're supposed to do, you don't know if you're getting a good sample. And so let's just think about this for a second. Everyone was doing everything new and they were super stressed. How do you know if this was going correctly? If they, again, did the student get this wrong because they dragged and dropped it the wrong way, or because they didn't know what they were supposed to do? Okay, so I've talked a little bit about advantages and disadvantages of virtual assessment. Now I'm going to dive into what I'm really worried about, which is ethical issues. But first, I am going to go up and check the chat. I'm going to try to check the chat. But let's talk about ethical issues. So thank you for answering my poll. Sometimes when I give a talk, I send out a pre-talk survey to find out what people are interested in. I was so excited that your organizers set up these polls for us. And so these are the ethical issues you identified. And I'm going to touch on most of them. And the ones I didn't already address, because I just got these yesterday and I had to weave this into my talk. So I think they're all going to resonate, but some I will address very overtly at the end. 3 people mentioned privacy and confidentiality, and one or two of those people mentioned online proctoring as a privacy issue. A couple of people mentioned cheating. One person mentioned copyright of materials. I'd say that's kind of privacy, but it's also, if you're a test developer, what's to stop a parent from, I don't know, being with binoculars in the other room and seeing the copyrighted materials? Access to computers, and not just computers, good computers that work the way they're supposed to work in a test. And let me say as well, when something goes wrong in school, there's a teacher there to say, during the test, there was a fire drill. This is this is the procedure we followed. And then construct validity. Somebody brought up construct validity. Are we testing what we said we were going to be testing? And one person, bless you, said, is it a real construct or was it developed just to be accessible and cheap? One person said consideration. I think that's probably means consideration for other people and the situations they're in. And then the issue of developing appropriate and accessible assessments in a virtual world. Okay, so how many of you know about the ILTA Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice? I'm sure most of you sleep with them underneath your pillow. Actually, funny story, I once went to a meeting, I guess about 10 years ago, and it was a meeting in a secure facility in DC. It was not a confidential meeting, it's just where we happened to be able to meet. And we had to all leave our phones and our laptops outside the room because of where the meeting took place. And we were discussing the ILTA Code of Ethics, and everybody tried to look it up. And I said, oh, I was actually working on a talk or a class or something that mentioned it, and I pulled it out of my backpack. So I felt like a really good testing person that day. So what are the ILTA Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice? So I just quoted this here. The Code of Ethics is a blend of principles that are supposed to have serious penalties, right? So it's, what's your code of ethics, right? So I want you to think about what a code is versus guidelines for practice. So guidelines are more practical, whereas ethics in this case are more philosophical. And it's really important because you can have all the philosophy you want, but what does it mean when the rubber hits the road, right? So in the guidelines for practice, there are 3 parts. They look at good testing practice in all situations. One looks at the rights and responsibilities of test takers. And then the 3rd part looks at classroom-based assessment. And one of the things I bolded here was that these guidelines apply to developing and using new technologies in language assessment. So those of us in testing who developed these, I was not one of them, alas. I think I helped to review them at one point. We're thinking ahead that there would be new technologies and to make guidelines that would anticipate this. I don't think anybody quite anticipated the situation that happened, but here we are. So what is the code of, what are the guidelines for practice tell us? So in the guidelines for practice, there are 9 principles, and they talk about what language testers need to do vis-a-vis language test takers. They talk about what this means in practice. And I just want you to know that when these were developed, and of course there still are paper and pencil tests, and there were computer-based tests, but I don't think a lot of us were thinking about home-based tests, thinking about test takers taking tests from their homes. So what do these mean when the world shifts? I am not going to go through all 9 principles for you. I do that in my testing class, and we do a few activities on it. I can't wait to update them for next year, because I will tell you, I've done a lot of workshops in my life, and none of them said, how do you address testing in a pandemic? But 2 of these 9 principles really stuck out. And I just want you to know they aren't the ones I usually focus on. There are 2, yes, I do have favorite testing ethics principles, but the 2 that really stuck out aren't the ones I'd focused on in the past. And I thought that was really interesting. And there were 3 and 6, which are be tested with measures that meet professional standards and that are appropriate given the manner in which test results will be used. And then have your test administered and results interpreted by appropriately trained individuals. And when you think about last spring, especially with classroom-based assessments and final tests, final exams, a lot of us weren't ready to interpret these appropriately. So looking at 4 and 6, there was a huge pivot by instructors and administrators and raters, testing organizations to administer these tests, to provide information on what had been learned, to look at progress, and to meet requirements. So this was really important. This pivot, or this pirouette, as I talk about, you know, we talked a lot about unprecedented and uncharted waters, but it's also not just that the waters are uncharted or unprecedented, but what do you do in these waters? What is ethical? Yes, we couldn't just halt and say, oh, we're not going to give any tests. No kids will get the seal of biliteracy. Nobody's going to get into college, or we're just going to halt language requirements for getting into university, because how do you know that these students are ready and that we're not doing them a disservice by admitting them? So what are these standards during a pandemic when all this stuff is halted? And frankly, when people are dealing with a huge issue. So what else do we need to think about? So what was identified by the field? Well, as I mentioned, my friends Dan Isbell and Benji Kreml talked about security, technology, and validity. And then these other topics that came up were access, placement, proctoring, and international teaching assistance. So let's look at this a little more. What I think we should be focused on during interruptions, the first thing is equity. One of my friends at Georgetown, I found out that they had so many problems with their internet. They live in an apartment building. I can tell you, I don't know, those of you who are at Temple, in my son's apartment, he has to sit in a certain place for online classes because it's the only place where his internet works well, right? So equity is a matter not just of access, but goodness of access, right? You can have internet, you can say, oh, all the kids have internet, it's going to be fine. But does it mean they have to take, their test sitting on the edge of the bathtub because that's where the best internet is? Let's really think about this. So equity is not an either or, it's a continuum. Another thing to think about is security. Another is validity, another is stakes. So I'm going to talk about each of these. All right. So equity. internet access is a really easy thing to focus on, right? You can say, this is how we're going to make it available. This is how we're going to address those issues. I'm not saying it's easy to solve. I'm saying it is a very easy issue to focus on. Another issue is noise. I actually taught an emergency class last spring for students who were evacuated from study abroad. It was a class on study abroad, super meta. And what I found really interesting was with this abrupt interruption, even students who were calling in from, various excellent zip codes, they were home, but they hadn't lived at home for 2 or 3 years. Some of them didn't have a desk at home because, their little sister got it when they went to college. They were working from the dining room or the kitchen. I remember one student coming to class and their mom came through and started scolding them for like watching Netflix or something. Apparently I look like, I don't know, Jennifer Aniston or something, never been mistaken for, a TV show. And the student was like, Mom, this is class. And then I had this long chat with the mom. And I remember thinking, okay, this works because, I'm super cool and I understand I never get to meet my students' parents because they're in college. But I thought, what if the student had been taking a test and their parent had come barging in? And what about when you're trying to take a listening test or a speaking test and there's somebody making noise in the next room? One of my friends wrote on Facebook this week that their son asked them to use their inside voice because he had a test that day. There's also the whole hardware issue. In addition to internet, do you have the hardware you need to connect to that internet to do what you need? And also, there are so many equity issues that we never thought of, because one of the issues with in-person school is that you can provide a similar experience for all students. I mean, just things like a desk chair. My spouse insisted I get a new desk chair last year because I'm a runner and my back was really going. And we got a really nice used desk chair online, and it was huge. The difference between my productivity when I would stand up after sitting for 3 hours and my back was, practically in spasms. And now when I've been sitting here for an hour talking to you and I feel great. So equity, and equity comes in so many domains. Like we can't always think about what's inequitable until it emerges. It's really hard to think about all these things. Okay, security. Oh, you're gonna like this one. All right. Is this person showing the kid how to use their iPad, or are they taking the test for their kid? Or is it a proctor, right? How good is your internet? Can somebody come in and if they're taking an actual test, can the person next door just, scrape all that stuff off of the internet, especially if you, I don't know, accidentally log into the Wheelock's internet instead of your own? You can also cheat. You can be texting your friend. Hold on. Elvis, I have not texted Sarah once during this session. I'm sure she's very sorry. Sarah Cushing is a friend of Elvis and mine, and we're all both in testing and we text each other about 50 times a day. But I just showed this, like, how do you make this, keep this from happening? And then finally, I thought this was kind of funny. I mean, I don't know if you all know this, but if you put a glass against a wall, you can hear conversations in it. How much is overheard in testing when you're testing a student at home? If you have twins, if you have kids similar ages taking similar tests, if I'm taking a licensure test in this room and my friend is in the next room, very bad COVID protocol, but it could still happen, right? So these are all issues that could arise with security. I also want to say something about equity with these issues. I worked really hard to try to find pictures that showed a broad range of people and did not show any sort of stereotype, except for, the older man trying to help a girl with her iPad. She could also actually be helping him with his iPad, so it could go the other way. Okay, just think about this for a sec. Validity. Oh, yes, I know it's been this long, Elvis, and I just got to validity. Are we measuring the same construct as we originally stated? For the tests that we have at ACTFL, I wasn't terribly worried about the construct. I was worried about all the other things because our tests were already online, right? We were already administering them. They'd been developed to be online. The pivot for us was logistical and equitable and security based. It wasn't based on the construct. But if you switch to online testing, especially if you look at some other tests, I just want you to think of some other tests that aren't administered online that might be administered, I don't know, with recorders or are played aloud for all students at one time in a room. How does this change the results? And can we make the same claims about these results as we did before? So are the claims different when you're administering a test at home? And then what support can we provide so that it will be fair and not influence the results, right? I worked on WIDA Access for a long time, and we were able to try these things out with real teachers where, we could say things like, you can do this in the classroom to support your students, but you can't do this, you can read the directions aloud, but you can't point to this answer. What constitutes support? What happens if a kid has an anxiety attack in the middle of taking a test? What kind of support do we provide to them? And how do we even know that it's happening if it's happening online? What about directions in multiple languages? Everybody picks that up as a great answer, but I want you to think about all the languages you know, and would you be able to follow directions in those languages if they were provided? Would you know what the words were for select versus choose in all those languages? So these are all huge validity issues that come up. I don't want to overthink this, but I also want you to think about the level of stakes for a test. You have something like classroom-based assessment, and then things like the TOEFL, and then something in between. I'm not saying that steel by literacy isn't critical and important, but it does have a different kind of stake than being, admitted to graduate school at Temple to study with Elvis Wagner or Paul. I mean, what could be a higher stakes than having your test not allow you to do that? Or to be certified to be a teacher, not just for that teacher, but for their students. So the stakes are also important when you're looking at this. Then we get into local issues. If you didn't have a way of assessing your students, what if you decide to use a large-scale test for your local decisions when maybe you were using an internal one before, something like international teaching assistants? What about when you can't use your local test to make your local decisions like placement or teaching assistants or going from one level of a class to another? In classroom assessment, I don't have answers to this, by the way. What is a classroom during a pandemic? I have tons of friends who are teachers, and my sister, the first grade teacher, she has it hardest and easiest. First graders will turn on their cameras. They want to see their teacher. They want to see their friends. They want to show everybody their cat, right? Then you get into middle and high school where, my teacher friends are speaking into a void, and the kids are learning in a void. What's a language classroom during a pandemic? And then how do you assess differently based on different classrooms? If you're teaching, ESL to group 1, and this is a super engaged class, everyone has, good access, they're really engaged, they turn on their cameras, versus another class that's different. Or worse yet, when you have a class which is mixed. Some students are engaged, some aren't, some have good internet, some don't, some have good internet one day, some don't. And how do these teachers with different resources provide fair assessment? One thing I have not focused on too is the teacher. There are instructors who have worse internet access than their students or worse resources than their students. How can they be expected to provide a fair level of assessment? So let's talk about classroom assessment. We need to focus on these 4 issues: equity, security, validity, and stakes. I once heard somebody say that a final exam was a low stakes assessment, and I looked at that person and said, not for the student. If anyone had ever told me that a final exam was a low stakes assessment, I probably would have, said something really awful to them. So when we're talking about classroom assessment, let's think about all these issues. Okay. So one of the things I just want to focus on in classroom assessment is the nature of language. Language is imperfect by nature. One of the issues with all of this security I saw in final assessments last year is, why do we want students to be perfect when they speak? I probably just made, 200 grammatical and other kinds of errors when I was speaking. And so over preparing for a test may result in a perfect sample, but it's scripted. I mean, except when I'm traveling in a country where I really need something, I'll go with my little piece of paper. Can I please have, 2 croissants, chocolate? But if they don't have chocolate croissants, man, am I out of luck. And this overuse of technology and this overthinking of security, it threatens equity, it raises the stakes, it changes the construct, it hurts communication, and it increases anxiety. When I teach language, I don't expect my students to be perfect. I expect them to be learning. Okay? And when you learn, you make mistakes. Okay. So let's go back to these issues you identified: privacy and confidentiality. We talked a little bit about that. Yes, I find online proctoring a little creepy. I have a teenage child, need I say more? I think we often talk too much about cheating and not enough about trust, but I think we hit on all these, and I really do want to say tests should be developed to test what they're supposed to test and not just be accessible and cheap. Okay, what about professional development? This is obvious. Language instructors need support in a virtual environment, whatever that is. And how has the last year changed how we teach and learn? We need to understand what it means to teach language virtually and what it isn't. We need to know what we need as language teachers, what our students need, what our administrators can provide, because there are limits, right? We need to figure out what's doable and work within those constraints. So we also need to know what our administrators cannot do for us and have them come back and say, I can do this. How do we make that work? Not, I can't do this, good luck. Okay. So some implications for professional development. We need to do a needs assessment. What does an institution need? What does Temple University or Washington Liberty Public School need for its language departments? What does the program need? The Spanish department might need something different than the Latin department, because this may come as a shock to some of you, but most people don't speak Latin. So, not a big deal if you can't record students speaking in that way. And what does the individual teacher need? One of my daughter's teachers really knocked herself out last year. She went to all of these online courses. She learned how to teach during online. I was really impressed. And so we really need to find appropriate ways to support how we teach the content of language, how we provide technological support, how we provide support to students. It just reminded me this morning when I had to update my Zoom, you can do everything right, and then Zoom can push an update and you're not ready for it. I also think teachers need more coaching. I think we all need more coaching individually. What do we need to do better? And we also need a community. The hardest thing about the pandemic has been the lack of physical community, and being able to look over at your friend in live time and see that she is, totally confused. I've actually been in a couple meetings this week where I've asked, well, Elvis and Paul know this about me. I often ask the obvious question and I feel kind of stupid. And then like 4 people text me, thanks for asking that. I had no idea what they were talking about. But that's much harder to do in an internet format when nobody has their cameras on. Other suggestions, when we do professional development, when we conduct it, we need to review these applications and effectiveness. We need to ask instructors and students. We need to look at the data, not just test data, not just survey data, but how engaged are people and what do they think 4 months later? As someone who teaches testing, very often my class is not considered very important until the teachers get in the classroom. I get so many emails from former students who say, I'm really sorry I didn't like your class when I took it. It's the most useful class I've ever taken. So we just need to be constantly reviewing these professional development needs. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about assessment and relationship. Assessment is an opportunity to communicate between students, instructors, and administrators. It's a way also to talk about expectations and outcomes and ways to improve. And in language, assessment is a literal opportunity to communicate. We use language to communicate, and in language teaching and testing, we use language to communicate about what we're learning. And so language forms relationships, and we should be using assessment to foster them. So going forward, let's look at this context. Look at these 2 kids, they're hugging, they don't have masks on. I know it's going to freak me out a little bit for a long time. Look at these kids, they're in a classroom. I think some of them are wearing uniforms. And you see how close they're sitting together. They seem to have a couple different adults in the room. I think they're all getting ready to take a test online in a classroom. Our political and social context continues to be challenging, and it's something we have to remember in teaching, in testing, and in life, which is basically what your conference is about. see all these kids taking a paper and pencil test. I think there still will be paper and pencil tests. I'm not saying they're going to go away. And hopefully next year, I'll see some of you at a conference on which we all get on a plane and then we stay in a hotel and then we meet in a lobby. That sounds exciting. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can take questions.
Okay. Thank you, Meg. Thank you so much for such a wonderful speech. It's very informative and relevant. I'm sure a lot of us resonate with the whole entire speech a lot. So we do have about 15 minutes for Q&A session. Would anybody want to ask any questions or any comments?
I'm very nice. I hardly ever snap at people. And if none of you ask a question, I'm going to make Paul and Elvis ask a question, and that's really awkward for them.
Okay, I'll jump in. You talked a little bit about the fact that when we started we didn't start the pandemic, but
we didn't start the fire. We did not start the fire, Sarah.
When there was a shift to online instruction and online testing, you were saying that there weren't any like guidelines on how we should do those. How long do you think it will take for us to? It's not my fault. How long do you think it will take, like, the testing community to develop good guidelines for online assessment?
Can I speak from personal experience? Mm-hmm. At Actful, it took us about 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
It was one of those things where on a Friday, oh, how are we going to do this? Because we develop the tests at Actful, and then we have a partner that administers them, LTI, and they said, oh, how are we going to do this going forward? So on Friday, my answer was X. I think we met as a group at Actful. On Sunday, my answer was Y. When we met with them on Monday, my answer was Z. By the following weekend, I was into AA, right? It's what you really have to focus on is the mission. What is the mission? And then looking at those 3 issues: equity, security, and construct. If you focus on those things, I'm not going to say it's easy. Like my colleagues at Actful and LTI would probably pummel me with erasers for saying that. It was challenging and it was difficult. But the truth is, I think at-home testing is here to stay in a lot of situations. Like when you think about it from an equity standpoint, there are a lot of people we can reach with at-home testing that we weren't with in-school testing. But I think going forward, we need to decide when we're going to offer it, how many different test forms we need. If you have an at-home form and an in-person form, is that going to raise how much a test costs? Because I can tell you, developing 2 versions or 3 versions of the same test is more expensive. So it's going to be different problems. I also think we're better situated to address these issues than we were. I often compare the pandemic to 9/11. I live in DC, where 9/11 was very different than New York, but it had long tentacles because we have this thing called the Pentagon 3 miles from my house. So for a year after 9/11, I had a 2-year-old, and I remember flying to Boston to see my mom, and I'd never remembered to bring my license unless I was renting a car. So the first step was bring your driver's license. They actually need to make sure you're Meg Malone, right? So that's one of the first things, security. I had to put things in my bag. I couldn't just walk in with a bottle of water. And then we had the, what we called, excuse my language, the potty rule. You had to be seated for 30 minutes before and after takeoff into DC, New York, and I think Boston. Try doing that with a 2-year-old, I'm just saying. And then that went away. So I think it's just going to evolve. I'm not really answering your question, but what it looks like now is not what it's going to look like in a year. There will be pieces, but we're going to be making different decisions. So just for most of you are too young probably to remember what life was like. Paul, remember what life was like before 9/11? You just got on a plane. My husband once got on a plane. He was late. They let him through security with a set of knives because he was going to a wedding, right? And that was the wedding gift, and he didn't have time to check them. Like, but that's a really good analogy. Like, think about when you're watching TV. Like, I was in a Zoom meeting with people who are doing recording they're filming for one of our tests at Actful, and they were in the same room. And I sent a private message to my colleague, and I was like, please tell me they live together or they're vaccinated, because they're sitting way too close for my comfort. And I was comfortable enough that I eventually asked them, and they kind of touched it. They're like, yeah, we're married, it's fine. I was like, I would never, a year ago, I would have been sitting that close to my colleague. So it's going to be really interesting. And I think with testing, we really have to think about equity. Elvis, were you going to ask me something? Oh, go ahead, Elvis.
I was. So I am very, very, intrigued by the ILTA Code of Ethics. And
do you carry it around with you too?
No, I don't. And I can't whip it out like you can, because you're the true nerd, but in a good way. But what impact do you think it really has on testing organizations? Do people just give it lip service? Is it truly something that test developers sit down and say, okay, we need to, consider this? And if it's just lip service, then how can we, not enforce it, but how can we give it teeth?
Okay, in my organization, at Georgetown, it's the first thing I teach in class, and I make it a part of my rubric. How does this relate to the ILTA Code of Practice and Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice? Like, you can't get all points on assignment in my class if you don't relate it to that. So looking at a washback idea, I make it a part of it. So that's from a PD point, right? You take testing with me, you at least spend 4 months of your life making me happy by quoting it. In my organization, how do I put this? Like, they're a part of me, they're like part of my value system, but I bring them out from time to time. Like, nope, we can't do that. That violates the ILTA Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice, whether it's internally with my partners or externally, or even saying to someone who asks a question. So I'd say they're more kind of part of my fabric, part of the fabric of what Actful is and how I behave as a tester. That's something I like whip out. I'm very lucky because our partners also know about the code and bring it up. For other people, I don't think the ILTA police are going to go around arresting people for not using the code, but I think it falls to us as developers and users to cite it. Like, my students, they do the whole, this is what it has to do with the ILTA Code of Ethics, but if you don't make it part of it from the beginning, it's never going to be a part of it. I actually think we should be talking about it more in professional conferences. Like, I was very happy to be quoting 3 and 6. I usually quote 4 and 8. Those are actually my favorite principles. So it sure was fun to focus on some other ones. Yeah, Elvis is trying to remember what 4 and 8 are, I could tell. And I would say this goes into equity too. Like, if equity is a part of your fabric, you are going to behave in a better manner. You're going to behave in a more equitable manner. Same with ethics. So we need to make it a part of our courses, and we need to enforce it. We need to say, okay, you just read an article, you just read a review of Duolingo by Elvis Wagner. How does that review relate to the ILTA Code of Practice and Guidelines, Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice? And I'm older than Elvis. I remember life before the Code of Ethics. I remember when Charlie Stansfield was working on them. I helped him edit them. So anyway, does that answer your question? Oh, Lena, hey.
Hey, I found a corner of my apartment that doesn't look like a bomb went off, so I turned my camera on. I'm curious if you have any sense of, I know that a lot of schools went test optional for the SAT and that kind of thing. Have those conversations trickled into the language space about making language testing optional? And how is that going to impact the way we move forward with language testing and all that kind of thing?
So I think language is different, and I'm going to tell you why. I think admitting someone to a program, you need to make sure that they have all the tools to succeed. So if I admit somebody to a PhD program, even if they get, what we call a full ride, I just want you to think about all the things that go into moving to a new country and signing up. You have to buy a plane ticket, thousands of dollars. You need to sign a lease or at least get a room to live in, thousands of dollars. You're giving up an income, perhaps, in your home country, countless amounts of money. So our job as language testers is to develop measures to make sure that any student we admit at least has the necessary language, right? I think of language testing for admissions as a very serious ethical issue, because you do all that, you come to another country and you're not ready to go, that's a huge disservice to you. Go ahead, Paul. You want to comment on that?
Well, my question is kind of about the issue of construct validity from a test interpreter point of view. So I think I've become more aware in COVID, but even before that, that like some people have real emotional issues about taking a test. It just freaks them out. And especially a multiple choice timed test. And yeah, I don't know as a designer what you can do about that, because of when you're doing massive testing, it's, what else are you supposed to do? I know there's a lot of other ways around it, but my question really centers on, as you're, say, an admissions officer or a state official interpreting someone's language testing results, an admission officer interpreting a GRE result or a TOEFL result, what do you think users of tests should bear in mind when they see a low score, maybe accompanied by a high GPA, or I'm thinking about this movement to just, can the SAT, can the GRE, can the TOEFL, and look at other things when you're trying to make admissions decisions, or
So let me back up a little bit.
Yeah.
Before you take the test, you need to know your rights. And there are accommodations for test takers, like extended time. One young person in my life who took the extended time once said they would never do that again because it made them more anxious. So I was very glad they had the opportunity to do both. So that's where the ILTA guidelines for practice come in on test takers' rights and responsibilities. Know what your rights are. If you're super anxious about taking a multiple choice test and you need extra time, you can get waivers for these things. Or if you have a physical condition where you need extra time, right? So even coming up to the test, and as someone who does admissions, so I have a child applying to college again. Luckily my children are good test takers. I'm not a good test taker, which is why I'm in testing. You always go to the thing you're bad at, right, to become better. There are countries, like a friend of mine whose kids applied to schools in Canada, like you need a certain GPA, you need a certain score, won't even look at you without it, right? And then there are schools that go somewhere in between. In terms of language, I want to make sure that the score is as representative as possible so that we don't not look at you just because of it. But I also want to make sure that if you show up, we haven't done you a disservice by admitting you and not said, hey, you want to study in Germany? Maybe you should spend another year getting your German down.
Yeah.
But I think, there's also a big difference between admissions to a large state undergraduate program and to a PhD program. Like, when we talk to people before, we don't just admit people without talking to them. Like, we have Zoom calls with them. We have admitted students day. I'm also less concerned about some tests for some schools, because some schools require an interview.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say how well you can write and read, but
Mm-hmm.
And that's super inequitable, because getting into like Old Dominion University versus Georgetown, there are different kinds of admissions procedures.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying, you need multiple data points, basically.
Multiple measures, Malone, that's my name.
Yes, okay.
Thank you everyone for your questions, and thanks Meg for your wonderful answers. It's almost 12:15, so I think it's almost time for us to close out our first keynote session. And thank you again, Meg, for your informative and insightful speech, and thank everyone for attending the session and sparking such a great discussion over the topic. We do want to give everybody a half an hour lunch break, so our next parallel sessions will start at 12:45, and also our second keynote session will start at 1:45, given by Dr. Paul Toth here. So yeah, we hope to see you around in the afternoon. Have a good lunch, and thank you, Meg, again.
All right, thank you so much. Okay.
I'm gonna stop the recording.
Oh, I have another meeting. I'll see you in half an hour. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.